I'm Sarah, 29 years old, and my father just pointed at me in front of a judge who happened to be his golf buddy and said, "This ungrateful daughter thinks she can steal what belongs to our family." He was demanding the Victorian house my mother had left specifically to me in her will. The judge nodded along while my father's attorney grinned, certain of their predetermined victory. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever had family try to steal what's rightfully yours, you'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Because when I saw that judge agreeing like my father's personal puppet, I knew exactly what game they were playing. See, I'd been expecting this corrupt little scheme ever since I discovered those country club membership records showing them as longtime golfing partners. Rich men and their backroom deals. They really thought they had it all figured out, didn't they? But let me take you back to how we ended up in this courtroom showdown. Because this story starts 29 years ago when I was born, and everything changed for the Montgomery family forever. Judge Thomas Montgomery never wanted to be a father figure in anyone's life, least of all mine. He made that crystal clear from day one when he decided that my very existence had somehow ruined his perfect bachelor lifestyle. Yeah, you heard that right. My father blamed me for disrupting his carefree life as a successful family court judge. Real piece of work, this guy. While he was busy climbing the judicial ladder and resenting having a child around, my mother Elizabeth stepped up to be both parents. Elizabeth Montgomery wasn't just my lifeline. She became my entire universe. She took care of me while my father disappeared into his courthouse kingdom, probably relieved he didn't have to figure out how to raise a daughter he'd never wanted in the first place. And honestly, his loss became my incredible gain. My mother thought she was being optimistic. She figured if she showed enough patience and love, maybe Thomas would eventually warm up and want to be part of my life. Sweet, hopeful woman who couldn't imagine anyone staying cold toward their own child forever. Growing up with just my mother was like living in a warm, supportive bubble where I was the center of someone's universe. Mom would help me with homework at the kitchen table while Judge Montgomery worked late, important cases. She taught me how to garden in the backyard of our beautiful Victorian house that had been in her family for 3 generations. She filled every birthday, every holiday, every school event with so much love and attention that I barely noticed there was supposed to be someone else there. Almost. Mother's Day was perfect, until I'd see Mom staring hopefully at the phone, waiting for a call from my father that never came. Christmas morning was magical, until I'd catch her setting aside a present for him that would go unopened. But I could see the disappointment creeping into her eyes every single time. The first time I asked why Daddy never played with us like other daddies, I was probably 6. Mom's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered beautifully. "He's very busy helping families, sweetheart. Very important work at the courthouse." Even at 6, I could detect the forced cheerfulness in that explanation. But I learned not to ask, because every question about my father made the woman I loved most look like someone had broken her heart all over again. By elementary school, I'd stopped expecting him altogether. Parent-teacher conferences. Mom was there taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. School plays. Mom in the front row with that old digital camera she refused to upgrade. Field trips. Mom volunteering as a chaperone while other kids' fathers showed up too. But here's the thing. We were genuinely happy. Really, truly content. Just the 2 of us against the world, and honestly, we didn't need some judge who couldn't be bothered to remember his daughter existed. Every major holiday, though, Mom would still reach out to him. I'd watch her dial his chambers with hopeful fingers, thinking maybe this time would be different. Spoiler alert, it never was. But that persistent optimism of hers, that should have been my first warning about exactly how ruthless my father would become when property and money were involved. The pattern of my father's absence became so predictable, I could have created a calendar around it. Christmas. Expensive gift delivered by his clerk with no personal note. Birthday. Generic card signed with just T. Montgomery. High school graduation. Silence so complete you'd think I'd vanished from existence. Meanwhile, Mom was building our life in the house her grandmother had passed down to her. The 1890s Victorian on Maple Street with its wraparound porch and original hardwood floors. She could have sold it and moved somewhere more modern, turned me into one of those spoiled kids who gets everything handed to them. Instead, she taught me values that my father had apparently never learned. "This house is about family history, Sarah," Mom would say while we refinished antique furniture together in the living room. "It's about creating something lasting, not just accumulating things." Wise words from a woman whose husband had clearly missed every lesson about what actually matters. Mom was equally grounded despite coming from old Southern money. She volunteered at the Literacy Center, organized neighborhood watch meetings, and somehow always found time to help me with school projects. Even when she had garden club meetings or book club gatherings, she showed up for everything that mattered to me. Every soccer game where I spent more time warming the bench than playing. Every science fair where my solar system model looked pathetic compared to other kids' elaborate projects. Every piano recital where I butchered Mozart, with the enthusiasm of someone who clearly hadn't practiced enough. Meanwhile, my father's judicial career was flourishing. Judge Thomas Montgomery, champion of family values and children's rights from the bench. The irony was so thick you could serve it for dinner. I'd see him quoted in the newspaper sometimes making profound statements about protecting children's interests and ensuring fair treatment in family court. And I'd think, yeah, tell me more about protecting children's interests, Dad. I'm fascinated by your expertise. When I turned 16, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was teenage rebellion. Or maybe I just got tired of pretending his indifference didn't hurt. I started asking the questions Mom had been deflecting for years. "Why doesn't he ever call me?" I demanded one evening after seeing his name in the paper discussing a custody case. "He talks about children's welfare in court every day, but he can't remember his own daughter exists." Mom set down her tea slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Your father has difficulty expressing emotion, sweetheart. Some people show love differently than others." "For 16 years?" I shot back. "That's not difficulty expressing emotion, Mom. That's a complete lack of interest. A really deliberate one." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. After 16 years of making excuses for her husband, even she was running out of believable explanations. High school brought college preparation, and Mom went above and beyond. SAT prep courses, campus visits, application fees for schools I probably couldn't afford. She supported every dream I mentioned, even the unrealistic ones. When I got into Vanderbilt University with a partial scholarship, she threw a celebration dinner that could have fed our entire neighborhood. My father's response? Nothing. Not even a phone call to acknowledge that his daughter had accomplished something worth noting. That's when I officially stopped caring whether he acknowledged my existence. I mean, what's the point of wanting recognition from someone who treats you like an inconvenience he never signed up for? During college, I'd come home for holidays and watch Mom get a little more tired, a little more resigned to handling everything alone. She'd ask about my classes, my roommates, my plans after graduation with genuine curiosity, because she actually cared about the person I was becoming. 22 years old, and I'd never had a real conversation with my biological father. 22 years of achievements and milestones he'd ignored by choice. I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in social work. Mom cried during my speech at the honors ceremony. She took approximately 400 photos and insisted on celebrating at the fanciest restaurant in Nashville. My father's reaction to my college graduation? Absolute silence, as usual. That night at dinner, Mom raised her wine glass with tears in her eyes. To Sarah, who proves every single day that the most important inheritance is character, not money. Looking back now, I should have realized she was already planning something significant, something that would finally force my father to show his true priorities. But at the time, I just thought it was another toast from the woman who'd been my champion through everything. College graduation was supposed to mark the beginning of my independent adult life. I moved back home temporarily while job hunting, and honestly, I was thrilled to be back with Mom in our beautiful house. The Victorian felt different, though. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with my being away at school. Mom wasn't quite herself anymore. She moved more slowly in the mornings, and I noticed her hands shaking slightly when she poured coffee. She'd get winded climbing the stairs to the second floor, something that had never been a problem before. At first, I attributed it to normal aging. She was in her late 50s after all. But something felt wrong, some instinct that whispered this wasn't just about getting older, Maybe we should schedule a physical with Dr. Patterson, I suggested one morning when she'd slept until 9 miles, completely unlike her usual 6 now a.m. routine. "Oh, honey, I'm fine," she dismissed with a wave that didn't convince either of us. "Just tired from all that gardening yesterday." Except she hadn't been gardening. I'd been watching her avoid the flower beds she'd always loved tending. The changes accumulated gradually, like water slowly filling a basin. Doctor appointments she forgot about completely. Conversations that seemed to confuse her halfway through. Moments of breathlessness that she tried to hide behind forced smiles. But I could see the worry growing in her eyes, and I knew she was scared of something she didn't want to name. By Thanksgiving, we couldn't pretend everything was normal anymore. The woman who'd organized every family tradition for decades seemed lost in her own kitchen. She'd start cooking and forget what she was making. Once I found her standing in the pantry, looking around like she'd never seen it before. "I can't remember what I came in here for," she admitted, tears starting to fall. "Sarah, I think something's wrong." That's when we knew we needed answers. The diagnosis came on a gray December morning that I'll never forget. Stage 3 ovarian cancer, Dr. Patterson explained as gently as possible. Advanced, but treatable with aggressive intervention. The prognosis wasn't encouraging, but there were options if we acted quickly. Mom aged 10 years during that doctor's appointment. I watched this strong woman who'd raised me through every crisis simply crumble as Dr. Patterson discussed treatment protocols and survival statistics. Her hands shook as she asked about chemotherapy, about surgery, about how much time we might have left together. 6 months to 2 years, typically, Dr. Patterson said quietly. But every case is different, Elizabeth. The most important thing now is starting treatment immediately and ensuring you have strong support systems in place. I quit my new job at the nonprofit the next day. "Sarah, you absolutely cannot put your career on hold for me," Mom protested during one of her clearer moments. "You have so much potential ahead of you." "My potential is right here," I told her firmly. "You raised me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to take care of you." And I meant every word. This woman had given me everything that mattered. Love, stability, values, confidence. The least I could do was give her my time when she needed it most. For the next 18 months, I became her full-time caregiver and advocate. Some days were manageable when the treatment was working, and we'd look through old photo albums together, laughing at pictures of my awkward teenage years. Other days were devastating when the chemo made her so sick she couldn't keep anything down, or when the pain medication made her confused and distant. But the absolute worst part wasn't watching her struggle with cancer, though that was agony. The worst part was watching her reach out to my father during those 18 months, begging him to spend time with his dying wife. "I won't be here much longer," she'd say into the phone, her voice breaking. "Please, Thomas, just one visit. Just so we can talk." The response was always the same. Too busy with important cases. Court schedule completely packed. Maybe next week. Next week never came. And watching my mother beg her own husband for basic human compassion was almost harder than watching the cancer take her strength. Have you ever watched someone you love fight a terminal illness? Share your experiences in the comments below, because this part of the journey was the hardest thing I've ever endured. Mom died on a sunny Tuesday morning in June, holding my hand while I whispered how much she meant to me, and how proud she was of the woman I'd become. Her last coherent words were asking if Thomas was coming, wondering why her husband hadn't visited her in the hospital. My father didn't attend the funeral. Let me repeat that for everyone in the back. Judge Thomas Montgomery, the man who lectured attorneys about family obligations every day in court, couldn't be bothered to attend his own wife's funeral. He called 2 days later, not to offer condolences, not to ask how I was coping, not to acknowledge that his wife of 30 years had died. He called to inquire about the house. "Sarah, we need to discuss your mother's property situation," he said in the same tone he probably used for mundane court scheduling. "There are legal matters that need immediate attention." "She's not even buried yet," I whispered, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Your mother is dead, and you're calling about real estate?" I heard him clear his throat impatiently. "Property matters don't pause for grief, Sarah. There are tax implications and ownership issues that need to be resolved quickly. I stood in the kitchen where Mom had taught me to bake cookies, listening to my father discuss inheriting her house like it was just another case on his docket. The conversation escalated when I mentioned that Mom had left the house to me in her will. "That's impossible," he said sharply. "I'm her husband. Marital property automatically transfers to the surviving spouse regardless of what any will says." "Not when the property was hers before the marriage," I replied, my voice getting stronger. "The house belonged to her family for 3 generations. You have no legal claim to it." "We'll see about that," he said coldly. "Don't get too comfortable in that house, Sarah. You might find yourself looking for somewhere else to live very soon." The conversation ended with him hanging up on me, leaving me standing in my mother's kitchen, realizing that the man who'd ignored me my entire life was about to try to take the only thing I had left of her. That phone call changed everything. For the first time in my life, I understood that my father wasn't just emotionally unavailable. He was actively calculating and potentially dangerous to anything I cared about. After the funeral, the house felt like a shrine to memories Mom and I had created together. Her favorite reading chair by the window where she'd spend hours with her books. The kitchen where we'd cook together every Sunday. The garden where she'd taught me that growing things required patience and consistent care. I'd find myself touching things she'd touched, sitting in places where we'd had important conversations, trying to feel close to the person who'd been my entire world. But the peace of grieving was shattered within a week when my father's attorney contacted me with legal documents. A formal challenge to my mother's will, claiming that as her surviving spouse, Judge Montgomery had superior rights to all marital property, including the family house. "This is harassment," I told Mr. Wilson, the family attorney who'd helped Mom with her estate planning. The house belonged to her family long before she married him. It was never marital property. "You're absolutely right," Mr. Wilson confirmed, reviewing the deed history. "The house has been in your mother's family since 1923. Your father has no legal claim to it whatsoever. But here's the thing about having a judge for a father. He understood exactly how to manipulate the legal system to get what he wanted, regardless of what the law actually said. The harassment campaign started immediately. Legal motions demanding access to every aspect of my mother's finances, looking for any angle they could use to support their claim. Depositions requiring me to explain my relationship with my mother, as if loving your parent was somehow suspicious. They wanted documentation of my mother's mental state during her final months, presumably hoping to argue that cancer had affected her judgment when she updated her will. What they found instead was medical records showing a woman who remained sharp and decisive right up until the end, someone who'd thoughtfully planned her estate to protect her daughter's future. 2 weeks before our court date, the pressure campaign became more personal and more sophisticated. Someone, and I'm sure it was a complete coincidence, leaked my address to every process server in the county. Suddenly, I had legal documents being delivered at all hours, reporters calling for comments about the family inheritance dispute, and neighbors asking uncomfortable questions about why my father was suing me. Anonymous tips started appearing on social media, questioning whether I'd manipulated a sick woman for financial gain. Blog posts wondered aloud whether I was mentally stable enough to own property, especially such valuable property in the historic district. It was a coordinated character assassination designed to make me look exactly like the kind of person who would take advantage of a vulnerable cancer patient. The strategy was ruthless, systematic, and completely typical of someone who'd spent decades using his judicial position to intimidate people into submission. But while my father was busy trying to destroy my reputation, I was quietly preparing something that would end this charade permanently. You see, I'd been thinking about his confidence in pursuing this case, not just his legal arguments, but his absolute certainty that he'd win regardless of the facts. And I'd been wondering why a judge would be so sure of victory in a case where he clearly had no legitimate claim. That's when I started researching who would be hearing our case. Judge Michael Harrison, presiding over probate disputes in our county. A name I'd heard before, but I couldn't quite place where. So I started digging deeper into Judge Harrison's background, his social connections, his professional relationships. What I found was exactly what I'd suspected. Harrison and my father weren't just colleagues. They were longtime friends who'd maintained a close personal relationship spanning their entire careers. golf buddies who played together every Tuesday at the Riverside Country Club, fishing companions who took annual trips to the lake house Harrison owned in the mountains. The week before our court date, I spent every free moment documenting their friendship. What I discovered was years of evidence showing that these two judges were much closer than casual professional acquaintances. Country club membership records showing them as regular golfing partners. Social media photos from judicial conferences where they were clearly enjoying each other's company. Even vacation pictures that Harrison's wife had posted online, showing both families together at various resorts and social gatherings. These weren't distant professional colleagues who occasionally crossed paths at legal events. They were genuine friends, close enough that Harrison should have immediately recused himself the moment our case was assigned to his courtroom. I made copies of everything I could find and organized them chronologically. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't some recent judicial friendship or casual professional relationship. They'd been actively socializing for over 15 years, sharing personal interests like golf and fishing that had nothing to do with court business. Mr. Wilson reviewed my research with growing concern. "These documents definitely show a personal relationship," he acknowledged. "But proving that the friendship creates an actual conflict of interest is more challenging than you might think." "You mean Harrison could rule in my father's favor and claim he was just following the law?" I asked. "Exactly. Judges have broad discretion in probate matters, and Harrison could simply argue that he's interpreting the will objectively regardless of personal feelings. In other words, Judge Harrison could steal my house, hand it over to his friend, and nobody could prove corruption unless he was stupid enough to show obvious bias in open court." The night before the hearing, I sat in Mom's living room, surrounded by all the legal documents we'd prepared. Medical records confirming her mental competence throughout her illness. Financial records showing the house's clear ownership history. Testimony from neighbors and friends who'd witnessed her explicit intentions regarding my inheritance. But my real ammunition wasn't any of those official documents. It was a simple folder containing 36 photographs and documents spanning 15 years, showing Judge Harrison and my father together at events ranging from golf tournaments to what looked like private family celebrations. Evidence that proved Harrison should never have agreed to hear this case in the first place. I also had something else. A pretty good understanding of my father's personality after 29 years of watching him operate. He was arrogant, used to getting his way through intimidation, and terrible at hiding his feelings when things didn't go according to plan. If Judge Harrison started showing the kind of obvious favoritism I expected, my father would probably get overconfident enough to reveal just how predetermined this whole proceeding really was. All I had to do was wait for the right moment, then remind everyone in that courtroom exactly what judicial ethics were supposed to mean. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a conservative black suit that projected competence and respectability. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that courtroom, not someone who could be dismissed as an emotional young woman making wild accusations. I also made sure to organize those photographs and documents perfectly. If things went the way I expected, I was going to need them readily accessible. The courthouse was busy when I arrived, with the usual mix of attorneys, family members, and court staff moving through the hallways. I walked past them confidently, carrying myself with the poise Mom had taught me through years of dealing with difficult situations. Judge Harrison's courtroom was packed with spectators. Word had spread about the judicial family inheritance battle, and local legal observers had come hoping for drama. My father sat at the plaintiff's table looking every inch the distinguished judge wronged by his ungrateful daughter. He'd even chosen his most conservative tie and formal judicial pin, apparently believing subtle authority symbols would influence the outcome. When he saw me enter, he attempted what I suppose was meant to be a paternal nod. It looked more like a predator acknowledging his prey. Judge Harrison entered with typical judicial gravitas, taking his place behind the bench with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled every aspect of the situation. He had absolutely no idea what was about to unfold. The hearing began exactly as I'd predicted, with my father's attorney presenting a masterful piece of legal theater designed to paint my mother as a confused cancer patient, manipulated by her scheming daughter. They had medical records taken completely out of context, testimony from distant relatives who claimed Mom had seemed different during her final months, and property documents presented in ways that made my inheritance look suspicious instead of straightforward. It was all carefully crafted nonsense, but it was well-presented nonsense delivered by expensive lawyers who clearly knew their audience. And Judge Harrison was definitely their target audience. He nodded sympathetically throughout their presentation, asked pointed questions about my mother's mental capacity during her illness, and seemed genuinely concerned about the possibility that a vulnerable cancer patient had been taken advantage of. The bias was so obvious it was almost insulting. This wasn't a judge carefully weighing evidence. This was one friend helping another friend steal property from his daughter. When our turn came, Mr. Wilson methodically presented our case. Medical evaluations confirming Mom's mental sharpness throughout her illness. Testimony from doctors and friends confirming her clear thinking and explicit intentions. Documentation showing the house's ownership history dating back 4 generations. Judge Harrison's attention visibly decreased during our presentation. He checked his watch repeatedly, shuffled through unrelated papers, and asked far fewer questions than he had during my father's case. By the time Mr. Wilson finished presenting our evidence, it was clear that Judge Harrison had already decided the outcome. We were just going through the motions of a fair hearing while he prepared to deliver the ruling his golfing buddy wanted. That's when I knew it was time to change the entire game. "Your Honor," Mr. Wilson said as he concluded our formal presentation, "before you make your ruling, my client has something important she needs to address with the court." Judge Harrison looked annoyed that the daughter wanted to speak, instead of letting the lawyers handle everything properly. "Miss Montgomery, this is highly irregular. Your attorney has presented your case quite comprehensively." "I understand that, Your Honor," I said, standing slowly and picking up the folder I'd placed beside my chair. "But there's a critical matter I need to bring to the court's attention before any decisions are made about this case." I could see my father's attorney leaning over to whisper urgently in his ear, probably warning him that I was about to try something unexpected. But my father just sat back with that confident smirk, apparently figuring that whatever his daughter was planning couldn't possibly threaten his carefully orchestrated victory. The man had no idea what was coming for him. "Your Honor," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "before you rule on this matter, I believe there's something crucial you need to consider." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a country club membership directory showing both Judge Harrison and my father listed as regular golf partners at Riverside Country Club. "This document shows that you and my father have maintained a close personal relationship as regular golfing partners," I said, holding it up so everyone in the courtroom could see it clearly. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something approaching genuine alarm. "Miss Montgomery, professional acquaintances and recreational activities are not grounds for recusal," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You're absolutely correct," I agreed pleasantly. "Professional acquaintances aren't grounds for recusal, but close personal friendships definitely are." I pulled out another document, social media photos from a judicial conference showing them laughing together at what was clearly a private dinner party. And this photograph, taken at what appears to be a personal social gathering, rather than an official judicial function, suggests a relationship that goes far beyond casual professional contact. The courtroom was completely silent now. I could hear reporters shifting in their seats, and my father's confident expression starting to crack around the edges. But I was just getting started with my presentation. I pulled out photograph after photograph, document after document, each one showing Judge Harrison and my father in increasingly social, friendly situations spanning over a decade. Golf tournament celebrations where they were obviously having a great time together. Fishing trip photos where they posed like old friends who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Even family vacation pictures where both their wives were present, suggesting the kind of close friendship that extends to family social circles. "Your Honor," I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm and professional throughout, "I have documentation spanning 15 years showing that you and my father have maintained what can only be described as a close personal friendship." Judge Harrison's face had gone pale, but he was still trying to maintain his judicial composure and authority. "Miss Montgomery, these allegations are highly inappropriate and completely out of line." "They're not allegations," I interrupted politely, but firmly. "They're documented facts supported by photographic evidence, membership records, and social media posts spanning multiple years. I spread more photos and documents across the defense table for everyone to see. Golf tournaments where you've competed together as a team. Fishing expeditions where you've traveled together to private locations. Family gatherings where you've celebrated personal milestones together. The silence in that courtroom was absolutely deafening. My father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before in his life, probably realizing for the first time that his dismissed daughter had been paying careful attention to everything around her all these years. Judge Harrison cleared his throat nervously, trying to regain control of his courtroom. Miss Montgomery, even if we were personal friends, which I'm not necessarily conceding, I am perfectly capable of remaining impartial in matters of law. That's when my father made his critical mistake. Standing up at his table, his face red with anger and frustration at seeing his carefully orchestrated plan falling apart in front of everyone. He pointed directly at me and shouted the words that would destroy both their credibility forever. This ungrateful daughter thinks she can steal what belongs to our family. Judge Harrison nodded in agreement before he could stop himself, then immediately realized exactly what he'd just done in front of a packed courtroom. The bias he'd been trying to hide was now on full display for every legal observer and reporter to witness firsthand. Perfect. I looked Judge Harrison directly in the eyes and delivered the line I'd been preparing for weeks, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the courtroom. Your Honor, what I'm telling you is simple. You cannot be both judge and his personal friend in this case. I have documented evidence of your friendship spanning 15 years, including photos of you together at private social events. If you rule in his favor, I will immediately file complaints with the Judicial Ethics Board and provide all this evidence to appropriate authorities. This would end your career. The courthouse fell so silent, you could have heard a whisper 3 floors away. Judge Harrison's face went through several dramatic color changes, white to gray to an alarming shade of green. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his gavel properly. The man who'd entered this courtroom confident in his ability to deliver a predetermined outcome was suddenly realizing that his entire judicial career was about to end in complete disgrace. We are not close friends, he stammered, his voice barely audible throughout the courtroom. And I will not show any favoritism toward the plaintiff. His voice grew slightly stronger as he continued, probably figuring this was his only chance to save his career and reputation. We have a clear will here from a woman who was demonstrably of sound mind when she wrote it. The medical evidence confirms her mental competence throughout her illness. The witness testimony supports her explicit intentions, and the property ownership history is unambiguous. He paused, swallowing hard and looking like he might be sick. The inheritance will remain exactly as Elizabeth Montgomery specified in her last will and testament. The house belongs to Sarah Montgomery, and this case is dismissed immediately. He banged his gavel with trembling hands and immediately fled from the bench, not even bothering with proper closing procedures or formal courtroom protocols. My father sat frozen at his table, staring at me like he was seeing me for the very first time in his entire life. 29 years of dismissing me as irrelevant, and I'd just destroyed his entire scheme in under 45 minutes. The reporters were already rushing toward the exits, cell phones pressed to their ears as they called in what would become the legal story of the decade. As the courtroom emptied around us, my father slowly stood and walked toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a brief moment, I thought he might actually try to apologize or explain, or somehow attempt to salvage what was left of our relationship. Instead, he looked me directly in the eye and said with cold finality, "You've destroyed everything I worked my entire life to build." "No," I replied calmly, packing the photographs back into their folder with steady hands. "I exposed what you actually built your life on. There's a significant difference." He left the courtroom without another word, his expensive legal team trailing behind him like mourners at a funeral procession. Justice wasn't just served that day. It came with a complete victory and total vindication. 6 months later, I was standing in the garden behind what was now officially and legally my house, watching the sunset paint the sky over the rose bushes Mom had planted and tended for decades. The legal battle was completely over, but more importantly, I'd finally found the peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The aftermath of that courtroom confrontation had been even more satisfying than the victory itself. Judge Harrison resigned within the week, citing personal health concerns that fooled absolutely nobody who'd witnessed his public humiliation. The State Judicial Review Board launched a comprehensive investigation that uncovered a troubling pattern of questionable decisions in cases involving my father's friends and political allies. My father's judicial career imploded even more spectacularly than I could have imagined. The Judicial Conduct Board opened an investigation into his use of personal relationships for private gain. The State Ethics Commission started examining Harrison's involvement in several of my father's previous legal matters over the years. Judge Thomas Montgomery announced his resignation from the bench 4 months later, claiming he wanted to pursue private practice opportunities. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on anyone familiar with our actual family history and the circumstances of his departure. But I wasn't interested in revenge or gloating over watching him suffer the consequences of his actions. I was too busy building the life Mom had always wanted me to have. I kept our family house and restored it to its original Victorian grandeur, incorporating modern conveniences while preserving all the historical details Mom had loved so much. I also started a nonprofit organization focused on supporting families dealing with terminal illness, using Mom's life insurance money and my own savings to create something meaningful from our experience. The Elizabeth Montgomery Foundation provides practical support and advocacy for families navigating the medical and legal challenges that come with serious illness. The work was incredibly fulfilling, connecting me with people who understood exactly what I'd been through with Mom. Every family we helped felt like a way to honor her memory and continue the values she'd taught me about helping others. 18 months after the trial, I met David Peterson at a charity fundraiser where I was speaking about family caregiving and legal advocacy. He was a social worker who specialized in hospital patient advocacy, passionate about protecting vulnerable people from exactly the kind of manipulation my father had attempted. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from healthcare reform to the moral obligations of inherited privilege. He was intelligent, principled, and completely unimpressed by my family's legal drama, which I found incredibly refreshing and attractive. I judge people by how they treat others when they have power over them, he told me over coffee after our third date. And what you did to protect your mother's legacy while standing up to corruption shows exactly who you are. We were engaged within 18 months, married in the same church where I'd delivered Mom's eulogy 2 years earlier. It was a beautiful ceremony surrounded by close friends and the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. My father didn't attend, obviously. According to local legal gossip, he was too busy dealing with ethics investigations and trying to rebuild his reputation in private practice. David and I honeymooned in Ireland, visiting the countryside where Mom's family had originated 4 generations earlier. Standing on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, holding hands with the man I loved, while surrounded by beauty that had endured for centuries, I felt the profound peace that comes from living authentically, according to your values. 2 years later, we moved permanently into the main house where I'd grown up with Mom. We converted the front parlor into David's home office and transformed the sunroom into a nursery. Our daughter, Elizabeth Rose Peterson, was born on a perfect spring morning, exactly 3 years after the trial that changed everything. She has David's gentle temperament and Mom's bright, curious eyes, and she'll grow up knowing she's loved unconditionally by parents who chose each other deliberately and consciously. Our son, William David Peterson, arrived 2 years later with my stubborn determination and his father's calm, patient nature. He'll never doubt for a second that he's wanted, valued, and cherished. My children will grow up in the same house where I learned about love, loyalty, and the difference between family and biology. They'll hear stories about their grandmother, who showed them that the most important inheritance isn't property or money. It's values, integrity, and the unshakable knowledge that they deserve love simply for existing. My father had spent his entire life chasing professional status and power that never satisfied him for long. He'd sacrificed every meaningful relationship for career advancement that ultimately meant nothing when his corruption was finally exposed. Meanwhile, I'd inherited something far more valuable than any house or property: the wisdom to recognize what actually matters in life and the strength to fight for it when necessary, regardless of who's standing in your way. If this story resonated with you, Make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about family, justice, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. Sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons about our true strength and determination. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey, and remember, the best inheritance isn't property or money. It's the values that guide us, the love that sustains us, and the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who we are and what we're worth. In the end, that's what Mom really left me. Not just a beautiful house with decades of family history, but the unshakable knowledge that I was worthy of love, capable of incredible strength, and destined for something infinitely better than the small, bitter life my father had chosen for himself. And that inheritance will last for generations to come.